The world outside your window moves fast. Its lights blink, its sounds rush, and its stories demand immediate attention. But tonight, we will turn our gaze not to the rushing present, but to the slow, deep currents of the American past, specifically to the years immediately following the great storm of the Civil War. We will settle into the quiet, gray space where a revolution promised, but where weary compromise ultimately settled in. This is the sound of history slowing down, the gentle rhythm of a nation exhausted, choosing inertia over action. Close your eyes and listen to the echo fade. The year is 1877. The air is still. The great violent spasm of the Civil War and the subsequent, often tumultuous period of Reconstruction have finally come to a definitive close. Picture, if you will, the landscape of the American South, vast, mostly agricultural, draped in a humidity that seems to slow the very passage of time. The sun rises over fields of cotton, not with the fierce demand for change that marked the previous decade, but with the quiet, resigned regularity of any other morning. The noise of the conflict, the hurried footsteps of soldiers, the urgent shouts of politicians, and the loud, disruptive clamor of freedom's first demands has receded. What remains is a quietness, a deep, pervasive sense of stasis. This profound stillness was formally cemented by what history calls the Compromise of 1877, a political arrangement so dry, so procedural, that it serves as the perfect bedrock for a sleep story. It was not a battle won, nor a treaty signed with fanfare, but a subtle, almost academic agreement reached in the smoky back rooms of Washington, D.C. The details are less important than the result, the final withdrawal of all remaining federal troops from the former Confederate states. We watch in our mind's eye as the last blue-clad regiments pack their tents, fold their standards, and begin the long, deliberate march northward. There is no fanfare in their leaving, only the measured thump-thump of boots on dusty roads, fading into the distance. With their departure, the era of federal supervision, the forceful hand attempting to reshape Southern society, simply ceased. It evaporated like morning dew under the slow, steady advance of the morning sun. The departure of these few thousand soldiers signaled a vast and quiet shift in the political gravity of the nation. In the South, state governments that had been tenuously supported by federal bayonets now stood on their own, often immediately reverting to the control of the pre-war landholding class, a class often referred to as the Bourbon Democrats. This was not a sudden overthrow, but a return. It was the slow, predictable settling of dust back onto the familiar furniture. Power, which had been momentarily unsettled and distributed among newly enfranchised citizens and northern newcomers, simply flowed back into its most accustomed channels. We listened to the quiet turning of the state legislative calendars, the slow reappearance of the names and families who had always held the keys to the local courthouse and the state treasury. This return to political familiarity fostered a deep social inertia. For the millions of formerly enslaved individuals who had tasted freedom and political agency during Reconstruction, this period became defined by a grinding loss of momentum. The promise of the land, the famous 40 acres and a mule, had long since dissolved. Now the right to vote,
to hold office and to pursue equal justice began to be systematically eroded, not through open rebellion, but through the slow, methodical application of local law and social custom. Imagine the atmosphere in a small rural county seat. The daily routine resumes. The general store opens, the same ledger books are used, and the rhythms of planting and harvest dictate the hours. The primary change, freedom from legal bondage, remains, yet the structural support for true equality is withdrawn. The state constitutions, rewritten only a few years prior with bold statements about universal rights, were now quietly being amended or simply ignored by local officials operating under the comforting assurance of federal non-interference. It is a story of political will draining away, leaving behind a vacuum filled with the most established and historically entrenched powers. The quietness of 1877 was not peace. It was merely exhaustion accepting stasis. We will spend the next hour tracing these quiet transformations across the American landscape, observing the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of rights and the firming up of rigid social structures. We will examine the federal government's withdrawal into procedural routine, the Supreme Court's methodical, often dry legal decisions that slowly undermined the power of the 14th and 15th Amendments, and the economic shift towards tenant farming and sharecropping that quietly bound individuals back to the land. Everything slows down now. We are observing the aftermath of a tidal wave where the water has receded, leaving the landscape permanently scarred, but superficially calm. Let the quiet details of this exhaustion wash over you.
The story of the steel skeleton begins far from the roaring furnaces, in the vast, quiet holding yards of the mill complexes that line the slow-moving Monongahela River. This is a narrative of preparation, of bringing together the separate elements that will eventually yield the great metal. We begin with the ore. Picture the arrival. Long trains, moving at a measured, consistent pace, pull into the yards. Each car is laden with the deep, rich, reddish-brown iron ore, often mined thousands of miles away near the cool, vast expanses of Lake Superior. This ore has traveled slowly, by water and then by rail, a heavy, patient passenger on the great network of American logistics. The process of unloading is methodical and repetitive, the immense claw-like cranes, moving with deliberate slowness overhead, scoop the heavy mineral from the train cars. Clank, scrape, clank. The sound is dull, heavy, a rhythm of work, not urgency. The ore is deposited into immense storage piles, quiet mountains of potential. They wait. They are blended and stacked with the other two essential components, coke and limestone. The coke, black and porous, arrives from the nearby Appalachian coal fields. It is the fuel, the source of the necessary intense heat and the crucial carbon agent. Its texture is brittle, its smell is sharp and earthy, and its role is to be consumed. The limestone, pale and white, is the purifying agent. It is the quiet chemical cleaner that will absorb the impurities within the furnace. These three ingredients, ore, coke, and limestone, lie side by side in their separate, silent heaps, their ultimate destination, the heart of the operation, the blast furnace. The blast furnace itself is a structure of imposing height, yet its daily work is characterized by a deep, continuous thrumming, a sound that is felt more than heard.
This furnace operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often for years on end, a tireless pillar of controlled internal chaos. Our focus, however, is on the filling, or the charging, which is a slow, cyclical process. From the quiet stillness of the storage yards, the materials must ascend. We follow the movement of the skip car. This is a heavy, inclined rail car built to carry immense loads. It climbs slowly up the slope of the furnace's exterior, a patient, rattling ascent into the structure's belly. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. The speed is restricted. The ascent is steady. It delivers its calculated load of ore, coke, and limestone to the very top, where it is quietly dumped through a set of carefully counterweighted bells. This system ensures that the furnace remains sealed, that the precious internal heat and gases are contained, and that the materials are distributed evenly across the vast column. Downwards through the heat, the chemical process begins not with a bang, but with a slow, searing descent. The coke burns fiercely, providing the intense temperature, often exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that is necessary for the next stage. The iron ore, now exposed to the heat and the carbon monoxide gas produced by the coke, begins its transformation. Oxygen is stripped away. The solid material softens, melts, and begins to flow, dripping slowly down the furnace's interior. This relentless, quiet dripping is the essence of the blast furnace's operation. It is a slow rain of molten iron, collecting at the very bottom, in the crucible or hearth. Meanwhile, the limestone has done its quiet, necessary work, absorbing the non-iron impurities, the silicon, the ash, the unwanted oxides, forming a lighter liquid known as slag. The slag floats patiently on top of the heavier molten iron. The furnace, in its internal chaos, creates 2 layers of liquid, waiting to be released. We focus only on the methodical drip, drip, drip of the iron, a sound that is lost to the roar of the fire, but is the true measure of the furnace's success. The steel age is built on this repetition. The charging is done, and the process begins again. The skip car descends empty, waiting for its next inevitable load. The furnace is constantly being fed, and its massive brick-lined walls hold the steady, unceasing heat. We will rest here for a moment, listening to the deep, consistent hum of the furnace, the sound of energy contained, the very pulse of industrial permanence. The great network begins, quite literally, beneath the ground. Our story opens in the quiet, dusty fields of Pennsylvania, the primary source of the crude petroleum that would eventually light a continent. Here, the wells dot the landscape, not the frantic, gushing spectacles of later eras, but simple, slow-working machines, gently drawing the dark, valuable liquid to the surface. The noise is minimal, the rhythmic, almost hypnotic creak and clank of the pump jack, a sound that is both mechanical and strangely pastoral. The first crucial step in the network is gathering. Once the crude oil is brought up, it is not immediately rushed away. Instead, it is collected in small, local wooden storage tanks. This is where the bureaucracy begins its patient work. Every barrel, every gallon must be meticulously accounted for. We imagine the lonely, dedicated oil gougers moving slowly from tank to tank, dipping their measuring rods and recording the precise volume and quality of the day's production in thick, bound ledger books. The ink dries slowly on the paper, documenting the exact moment and quantity of the transaction.
This rigorous, slow accounting ensures that every producer is fairly paid and, crucially, that the central authority knows the exact inventory at all times. This is the foundation of standardization, the reliable measurement.
From these local holding tanks, the oil begins its first movement, often via the vast, silent circulatory system of the pipeline. This was the greatest logistical achievement of the era, a series of iron arteries laid beneath the farms and forests, moving the oil without the noise and disruption of rail cars. The oil does not rush through these pipes. It flows at a regulated, deliberate pace, pushed by powerful yet unseen pumping stations placed miles apart. Imagine standing beside one of these early pumping stations in the dead of night. Inside, the immense steam-driven engine works with a slow, powerful consistency. Piston, release, piston, release. The engineers are quiet, methodical. Their job is not to accelerate the flow, but to maintain the pressure, a steady, unvarying force, ensuring that the flow rate remains exactly the same, hour after hour, day after day. This consistency is the key to the entire system. It allows the refinery managers hundreds of miles away to predict with almost surgical precision the exact moment the next shipment of crude will arrive. This predictability had a profound, calming effect on the entire industry. It removed the element of chaotic surprise that had characterized earlier phases of the oil boom. The erratic price swings and wild speculation were gradually replaced by the comforting, predictable line of a graph showing consistent supply. The knowledge that oil was constantly moving, consistently measured, and reliably flowing provided a sense of industrial tranquility. The crude oil eventually pools at the vast, centrally located refinery centers, often situated near major transportation hubs like Cleveland or Bayonne. Here, in the immense storage farms, the oil waits again. The holding tanks stand tall and silent, reflecting the surrounding industrial landscape. The air is heavy with the subtle, distinct odor of petroleum. Yet even in these vast storage farms, the system is quiet. Pipes, valves, and gauges are monitored by solitary, disciplined technicians whose only job is to ensure the exact level is maintained and the temperature is controlled. The quiet, bureaucratic machinery of standardization is always at work, ensuring that the raw material is ready for its transformation without haste, without error. We will now turn our attention to the meticulous, methodical process within the refinery itself, the slow application of heat that transforms the dark crude into the clear, luminous kerosene, the true commodity of reliable light. Everything proceeds at a controlled, unhurried pace, a testament to the power of methodical organization over frantic speed. The schedules introduced the concept of predictable rhythm. They demanded that the train, a powerful and chaotic machine, submit to the clock. The engineer's eye was constantly on the dial, ensuring that the engine was neither too fast nor too slow, maintaining the necessary distance between the train ahead and the train following. We listen for the rhythmic chuff, chuff, chuff of the locomotive, a sound of controlled, consistent effort, not hurried speed.
This consistency meant that a carload of wheat loaded in Kansas could be predicted to arrive at the Chicago grain elevator on a specific predetermined hour days later. This predictability was the most valuable commodity the tycoons sold. It replaced the gamble of wagon transport with the solemn mathematical certainty of the rail system. The schedules were not just about movement, they were about trust. Trust that the steel lines, however geographically separate their owners might be, would eventually coordinate their functions to create one seamless continental whole. This quiet, paper-based coordination was the true mechanism of transcontinental consolidation. We will now turn to the financial and legal agreements, the tariffs and interchange contracts that further cemented this complex relationship, tracing the slow, methodical, bureaucratic work required to handle goods that crossed the tracks of two or more rival corporations. This is the story of paper conquering distance and of bureaucracy forging a nation. Tonight, we will explore the quiet expansion of the American city, not through dramatic skylines, but through the patient, inevitable laying out of streets and lots. We are observing the meticulous process by which vast farmland becomes a predictable, standardized grid, a pattern of quiet geometry imposed upon the wilderness. Imagine the surveyor's chain, stretched taut and straight, measuring out the future, one methodical segment at a time. The growth of the city is not a sudden eruption, but a slow, continuous accretion. Settle your mind now and listen for the rustle of the zoning map, the faint thump of the surveyor's stake, and the deep, steady rhythm of bricks being laid one upon the other, forging an urban peace. The story of urban sprawl begins miles from the established downtown, in the empty, waiting fields that surround the city's core. This is the domain of the surveyor, the quiet professional who translates the abstract concept of expansion into tangible lines on the earth. We picture the surveying team working in the late 19th century quietude, a man with a heavy brass transit standing patiently, sighting the horizon, while his assistants carefully drag the gunter's chain across the rough ground. This chain, exactly 66 feet long, is the rhythmic instrument of the sprawl. Its movement is slow, precise, and entirely repetitive. Clink, drag, stop, measure. Clink, drag, stop, measure. With this meticulous process, the land is divided into perfectly rectangular parcels. These are the blocks and lots, the fundamental, standardized units of urban life. Before any building can begin, the land must be partitioned, named, and recorded. This is the first essential bureaucratic ritual of growth. The resulting maps, known as plats, are submitted to the county recorder's office, thick rolls of paper detailing the precise angles and measurements, often signed in neat, elegant script. These plat maps are the quiet, often ignored foundation of the entire metropolitan area. They dictate the future shape of the streets and the alignment of every future home. The initial work is driven by the speculator, not the frantic figure of popular lore, but the quiet investor who acquires raw land far from the city limits and waits. Their business is based entirely on the patience of the grid. They know that if the city continues its slow, predictable expansion, their distant parcels will eventually be incorporated into the network of roads and utilities. The investor's primary tool is not the hammer, but the ledger book, meticulously tracking taxes, interest payments, and the slow, gradual rise in property value over years. Next comes the quiet work of infrastructure. Before the homes, before the residents, there must be the pipes and the tracks. We observe the steady procession of crews laying water mains and sewer lines, dark, heavy cast iron pipes being lowered into deep linear trenches. The work is laborious, but the rhythm is slow and continuous. Shovel scrape, rope lower, joint seal. This system, hidden beneath the earth, is the true lifeblood of the sprawl, extending the city's vital functions block by careful block. Crucially, the sprawl is always guided by the streetcar line. In New York, it was the slow extension of elevated rail lines, and in Chicago, the streetcar and elevated railway lines. These transit lines were not placed randomly. They were engineered to follow the most logical, straight path outward, providing the predictable artery that future neighborhoods would cluster around. The extension of the tracks, the slow process of laying the wooden ties, the steel rails, and the overhead electrical wire, is the final cue for the builders. Where the tracks go, the people will follow. The entire process is one of slow, inevitable momentum. There is no need for sudden haste. The city's population increases steadily year after year, guaranteeing a constant, measured demand for housing. The sprawl is an engine of predictable supply meeting predictable demand. We will now turn our attention to the actual construction, following the quiet, repetitive work of the masons and carpenters as they fill the empty spaces within the newly laid out grid. We are observing the conversion of raw land into standardized human habitat, one slow stroke at a time. The process of Ellis Island began long before the steamship docked in the upper bay of New York. It began with the creation of the manifest. Imagine the steamship office in Hamburg or Liverpool or Naples. Days before sailing, clerks sat at large wooden desks, dipping their pens into inkwells and meticulously transcribing the details of every soul who had purchased passage to the United States. This document, the manifest, was the first and most crucial piece of the bureaucratic puzzle. It was a long, wide sheet of paper divided into columns, often 30 or more, that demanded precise answers to precise questions. We focus on the quiet ritual of its completion: name, age, gender, marital status, occupation, last permanent residence, final destination. Who paid for the passage? Have you ever been in prison? Are you a polygamist? The questions were exhaustive, and the process of recording the answers was slow, careful, and repetitive. This document, often composed in the neat, disciplined hand of a seasoned clerk, traveled across the ocean with the passengers, sealed and protected, a collective memory waiting to be verified. Now the ship has arrived. It anchors far out in the bay. The first people to disembark are not the immigrants themselves, but the inspectors who board the ship to examine the documentation. they quietly take possession of the manifests. These documents are now transferred to the barges and ferries that carry the steerage passengers, the majority of the immigrants, to the dock of Ellis Island. The manifests arrive before the people, waiting patiently on the inspector's desks, the silent roll call ready to begin. The immigrants' first experience on the island is defined by the line. This is not a chaotic mob, but a structured, slow-moving queue, governed by the steady hand of the process. Hundreds of people, separated by the lines chalked or roped off in the cavernous registry room, move at a pace dictated by the speed of the inspector's pen and the interpreter's voice. The noise is a low, continuous murmur, the shuffling of shoes, the whispered instructions in dozens of languages, and the echo of the high ceiling. It is a noise of patience, of waiting. We focus on the register of arrivals, the ledgers that sit on the inspector's desk. These are massive, heavy books, often bound in dark leather, containing the blank forms that will ultimately house the official record of entry. The inspector does not look at the immigrant first. He looks at the manifest. He is confirming a pre-existing piece of data. He reads the name from the ship's log and transfers it to the official register. Column 1, list number. Column 2, family name. Column 3, given name. We hear the names being read, one by one, slowly, sometimes mispronounced, but always recorded. The sheer repetition of this process is what defined the island's daily routine. It was the methodical, quiet grinding of the bureaucratic mill, turning human beings into formalized entries. This meticulous, slow transfer of information is the core of the Ellis Island experience. The inspector's hand moves with trained precision, making sure the ink is clear, the spelling is consistent, and the date is absolutely correct. Every detail must align with the documentation received from the steamship company. The goal is not speed, but flawless, documented entry. We will rest our attention on the rhythmic scratch of the inspector's pen, tracing the names that become the beginning of millions of new American stories. The genesis of the progressive era was not in the streets, but in the libraries, universities, and quiet, well-organized offices of nascent think tanks. The driving force behind these reforms was the profound belief in expertise and data. The reformers did not rail against industry itself. They simply sought to measure it, understand it, and make its operations predictable and efficient.
Imagine the atmosphere in the new, expanding university departments of sociology and economics. Professors and graduate students, working late under the steady glow of electric lights, were conducting the first large-scale surveys of American life. They were collecting figures on poverty, analyzing sanitation systems, and meticulously recording the frequency of industrial accidents. This quiet accumulation of raw, undeniable data was the first whisper of the progressive movement. The reformers, often referred to as muckrakers, not because they sensationalized, but because they meticulously uncovered the facts, believed that if the public was simply presented with the objective, cold reality of social and economic inefficiency, change would inevitably follow. We focus on the repetitive task of compiling reports. Think of the weight of the paper, the precision of the charts and graphs, the lengthy appendices detailing specific municipal bond issues or factory safety violations. The work was slow, painstaking, and entirely focused on numerical truth. One of the most profound early successes of this rational approach was the establishment of city manager systems and nonpartisan elections in local governments. The reformers argued that managing a city, its roads, its water, its police force, was not a matter of political ideology, but of pure administrative science. Why should a politician, they reasoned, manage the sewage system? That job required an engineer. We observe the quiet creation of these new municipal bureaucracies, the drawing up of organizational charts, the writing of civil service examinations designed to ensure competence over cronyism, and the slow, tedious process of transitioning power from elected ward bosses to appointed, trained professionals. This shift was a victory of the abstract over the personal. It meant that decisions about street paving or garbage collection were now governed by a formula of efficiency, calculated costs, and long-term planning, rather than by political favor. The ultimate goal was to remove the unpredictable human element, the graft or corruption, and replace it with the smooth, predictable workings of a well-designed machine. The resulting paperwork, the budget sheets, the quarterly performance reports, the standardized forms, piled up quietly in the new municipal offices, forming the visible proof of the progress toward order. The entire movement was characterized by this deliberate pace. Reform was not a sudden burst of energy. It was the slow, continuous application of a logical system to a chaotic problem. Before a law could be passed, a commission had to be formed. Before a commission could act, an exhaustive study had to be completed. And before a study could begin, the data had to be collected and verified. This methodical, unhurried chain of events defines the tranquil rhythm of the early progressive era. We will now turn our attention to the federal government, observing the cautious, incremental creation of the first true regulatory bodies, tracing how the whisper of efficiency gradually solidified into the heavy, bound pages of the Federal Register. Our quiet tour begins at the heart of the exposition, the Grand Basin and the surrounding Court of Honor. The time is just past midnight. A high, pale moon casts its light, mingling with the soft, constant illumination provided by the newly harnessed electricity. The noise is negligible, perhaps the faint, distant lap of the water against the marble-like banks of the lagoon, and the occasional creak of a boat moored for the night. The most striking aspect is the color. The white city was not truly white. Its immense facades were constructed of a material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber. In the daylight, this material was bright, but now, under the controlled, gentle electric glow, it possesses a luminous, creamy ivory tone. Every column, every frieze, every massive archway absorbs and diffuses the light, preventing any harsh shadows. The city seems not merely illuminated, but self-illuminated. We stand facing the water. The lagoon is perfectly still, acting as a colossal, flawless mirror. The majestic outline of the administration building, with its central gold-leafed dome, is reflected with absolute symmetry in the dark water. The effect of visual doubling and repetition dominates the entire space, creating a profound sense of ordered tranquility.
To our left and right stretch the immense linear facades of the main exhibition halls. The machinery hall and the agricultural building stand across from one another, their dimensions staggering, hundreds of feet long, designed in the majestic classical language of the Beaux Arts style. We observe the endless procession of columns. Each column is identical to the next, spaced with perfect precision,
creating a slow, rhythmic visual pulse that guides the eye down the entire length of the court. This is the geometry of quiet power. The architecture is deliberately repetitive. The designers understood that scale demanded simplicity and standardization. The arches over the entrances are grand, but their curves are predictable. The figures and statues that adorn the roof lines, representing commerce, industry, and art, are held immobile in their plaster dignity, silent observers to the night. They are too distant to be demanding, serving only as quiet visual markers along the immense expanse of the roofline. The ground beneath our feet is a perfectly level, broad expanse of paved walkways. They are entirely clear now. We notice the detail of the street lighting. Thousands of incandescent bulbs, small sources of gentle heat and soft light, arranged in deliberate, consistent patterns. The lighting engineer's goal was not dramatic effect, but uniform illumination, ensuring that every facade, every pathway received a consistent wash of light. This standardization of light contributes more than anything to the white city's pervasive sense of calm. The predictability of the glow allows the mind to rest, knowing that no corner is unexpectedly shadowed, no detail is harshly exposed. The only movement is the slow, barely perceptible drift of the surface water in the lagoon, a slow, gentle ripple disturbing the reflections. We will continue our quiet journey, tracing the meticulous planning and the grand, repetitive scale of the white city's architecture, one gentle facade at a time. The 17th Amendment aimed to change Article 1, Section 3 of the original Constitution. To understand the long wait, we must first quietly examine what was being weighted against, the original foundational design. The Founding Fathers, in their wisdom and their necessary compromises, stipulated that U.S. senators would be chosen not by the direct vote of the people, but by the state legislatures. The intention was to create a Senate insulated from the immediate passions of the electorate, a chamber that would represent the deliberate will of the states as sovereign entities. This meant that every 2 years, the legislatures of all states with an open Senate seat would engage in the slow internal procedure of casting ballots, often over multiple exhaustive sessions. For decades, this system operated with a quiet, if sometimes inefficient, regularity. The process was confined to the state capitals, hidden away from public view. But as the 19th century drew to a close, a deep, pervasive unease began to settle around this mechanism. The complaints were not sudden outbursts. They were slow, accumulating concerns, documented in dry reports and legislative transcripts. The central problem was legislative paralysis. The selection of a senator often consumed state legislatures for weeks, sometimes months, diverting their attention from the necessary and often mundane work of passing state budgets, managing schools, and regulating local affairs. We picture the members of a state house repeatedly casting ballots, none yielding the required majority, the process grinding to a halt, day after weary day. This inefficiency became a powerful, quiet argument for change. The reformers, the early progressives, did not argue with shouting, they argued with resolutions. The primary tool for initiating this monumental constitutional change was the memorial or resolution from the state legislatures to the United States Congress. The Constitution allowed the states to petition Congress for a convention to propose amendments.
This started a slow, repetitive drumbeat of political will originating from the periphery and moving toward the center. Imagine the annual calendars of state legislative bodies across the nation. Year after year, in Massachusetts, in Iowa, in Nebraska, a legislator would rise and introduce the same motion, a call for a constitutional amendment to elect senators by direct vote. The resolution would be referred to a committee, a slow, patient process of referral, deliberation, and eventual committee vote. The first states began this process in the 1990s. One state passed a resolution, then another, then another. The process was not synchronized, it was entirely organic. Each state acted independently, moving at its own governmental pace. The reformers knew they needed 2/3 of the states, then 30 out of 45, to successfully petition Congress for a convention. This required an immense, sustained, and unhurried campaign of persuasion, one legislative body at a time. The effort was defined by the quiet accumulation of affirmative votes, documented in the legislative journals that tracked the state's slow, steady movement toward change. We listened to the faint, continuous whisper of resolutions traveling by rail and mail to Washington, D.C., each one a quiet demand for systemic reform.
We will now turn to the U.S. Senate itself, the institution that was being asked to vote for its own democratic redesign, observing its slow, methodical resistance and the eventual, reluctant surrender to the steady, accumulating pressure from the states. The story of the Federal Reserve does not begin with legislation, but with fear, specifically the financial panic of 1907. This crisis, where a wave of banking failures froze credit and brought commerce to a halt, demonstrated that the American financial system, reliant on thousands of independent banks, was structurally weak. There was no central mechanism to inject liquidity, no unified hand to prevent the contagion of fear. Following this panic, the initial response was not swift action, but patient study. We focus on the establishment of the National Monetary Commission, 1908. This commission spent 4 long years traveling, interviewing bankers, studying the central banking systems of Europe, the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and quietly compiling exhaustive multi-volume reports. The work was slow, methodical, and academic. The resulting documents, heavy, detailed tomes, were the intellectual blueprint for the Fed. They contained no drama, only data, analysis, and carefully reasoned recommendations for a new, unified structure. This intellectual effort culminated in the drafting of the Federal Reserve Act. The key to the legislation was decentralization. The founders wished to create a system that was centralized enough to be powerful, but decentralized enough to avoid the concentrated political risk of a single monster bank located only in New York or Washington. The solution was the division of the entire continental United States into 12 Federal Reserve districts. Imagine the map on the wall of the legislative drafting room, divided by thick ink lines that followed neither state boundaries nor population lines precisely, but rather the established economic arteries of the nation. The goal was to ensure that each district, from Boston to San Francisco, from Minneapolis to Dallas, was a self-contained economic entity capable of understanding and managing the specific banking needs of its region.
The naming and delineation of these districts were finalized with quiet precision. District number 1, Boston. District number 2, New York. District number 3, Philadelphia, and so on, through the numbered list, each city designated as the quiet administrative center for its vast economic zone. The resulting structure was dual, designed for checks and balances. At the very top, the Federal Reserve Board, later the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., would set national policy. Below it, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks would execute that policy and maintain the operational relationship with their member banks. This was not a hierarchy of command, but a structure of cooperation, where policy was set centrally but implemented regionally. The entire structure was designed to move slowly, deliberately, and with necessary consultation. We will now turn to the most fundamental stabilizing function of this new system, the quiet management of bank reserves and the methodical, unseen process of clearing checks across the entire continental network. This is the quiet work that ensures that money, the bloodline of the economy, flows with predictable and standardized calm. The legal campaign against monopolies, which reached its methodical peak under President William Howard Taft, rested entirely on the quiet, often ignored language of a single law, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This act, passed years before the great trusts fully matured, provided the essential abstract foundation for all future legal action. The act itself is a model of legal simplicity, containing vague but powerful language designed to prohibit any contract, conspiracy, or combination that resulted in a restraint of trade. However, for 2 decades after its passage, the law lay mostly dormant, its power unused or misapplied. The early legal efforts to enforce it were often clumsy and unsuccessful, demonstrating that the dismantling of corporate power required not just a law, but a specialized, patient legal bureaucracy. This needed bureaucracy began to take shape within the Department of Justice, DOJ. We imagine the quiet, cavernous offices of the Attorney General, where a dedicated team of lawyers and investigators were assigned the immense task of constructing a legal case against a corporation that might span 20 states and control an entire industry. The process was defined by the slow, necessary work of discovery. Discovery is the meticulous process of forcing a corporation to surrender its internal documents, its contracts, its ledgers, and its correspondence. This was not a quick raid. It was a formal legal demand backed by the power of the federal court. Thousands upon thousands of pages of corporate records were transferred from bank vaults and executive offices to the lawyers' desks at the DOJ. We focus on the repetitive, monotonous task of the junior staff, reading and indexing. Every letter, every ledger entry, every internal memo had to be read slowly, categorized, and cross-referenced, all searching for the telltale phrase or figure that proved intent to restrain trade. This evidence gathering often took years, marking the first necessary delay in the legal process. The government could not simply assert that a monopoly existed. It had to prove, with exhaustive documentation, the mechanisms through which that monopoly was maintained, the precise contract that fixed prices, the specific agreement that carved up territories, or the exact moment a small competitor was intentionally undersold and driven out of business. Once the evidence was categorized and bound into heavy, numbered volumes, the actual litigation began. The case was filed, a formal complaint was served, and the corporate lawyers began their equally slow, methodical defense. The courtroom proceedings themselves were usually devoid of high drama. They consisted primarily of attorneys reading long passages of depositions, presenting endless statistical tables, and arguing minute points of legal precedent.
When William Howard Taft assumed the presidency, he brought with him a profound respect for the law's deliberate pace, a pacing he maintained and accelerated during his term. Taft, himself a former federal judge and later the only person to serve as both president and chief justice, saw the antitrust fight as a precise legal exercise, not a political crusade. His administration was defined by the quantity and quality of the suits filed, all moving through the courts with careful, unwavering progression. The goal was not sensationalism, but the slow, inevitable establishment of legal certainty, the knowledge that the law was predictable and relentless. We will now examine the slow, methodical process of one of the era's most crucial legal battles, the breakup of the colossal Standard Oil Company, tracing the case's movement through the lower courts and up to the Supreme Court, all at a pace dictated by the calm, unchanging rules of federal procedure. The campaign for the 19th Amendment was a study in decentralization. Because the Constitution left the rules for voting largely to the individual states, the national effort was necessarily divided into dozens of concurrent, often tedious legislative battles fought at the local level. The strategy was simple, but required immense patience. Gain suffrage one state, one referendum, one legislative victory at a time. The earliest successes came not in the established, rigid East, but in the sparsely populated, politically fluid territories of the American West. In these vast, often quiet spaces, social customs were less entrenched, and the need for stability and population often made legislators more receptive to radical ideas. We look first to Wyoming Territory, 1869. The passage of the first women's suffrage bill here was not a result of a massive public demonstration, but a quiet, almost political afterthought. The reasons were complex and local: a desire to attract female settlers, a touch of political maneuvering, and a simple, abstract sense of fairness. The territorial legislature, small and often meeting in makeshift conditions, passed the bill with relatively little fanfare. It was signed into law, and when Wyoming achieved statehood in 1990, it became the first state where women voted. The process was slow, contained, and entirely procedural. A single bill moving through a small committee, passing a simple vote, and being recorded in the territorial statute books. The victory in Wyoming was the first affirmative checkmark on the long blank national scorecard. It was followed slowly by similar victories in Colorado, 1893, Utah, 1896, and Idaho, 1896. These states became the laboratories of suffrage, proving grounds where the practical effects of women voting could be observed and documented. The results were generally quiet. Elections were not disrupted, society did not collapse, and government continued its slow, methodical routine. The data was collected and filed away, providing the necessary dry evidence needed to convince the more resistant states further east. The primary tool of the suffrage campaign during these decades was the petition.
We focus on the repetitive, organized work of countless women in parlors and church basements collecting signatures. Each petition was a standard form. We, the undersigned citizens of state name, respectfully petition your honorable body to grant women the right to vote. The work involved hours of patient canvassing, polite explanation, and the slow, rhythmic sound of ink on paper. These petitions were then organized, counted, and bound into massive rolls, often requiring wheelbarrows or carts to deliver them to the state legislature. The spectacle of the volume of paper was the message, a quiet but undeniable demonstration of widespread, persistent demand. Once delivered, they would be quietly referred to a legislative committee, the Elections Committee or the Judiciary Committee, where they would often languish, sometimes for years, until the political environment allowed for a brief procedural hearing. This was the rhythm of the movement for decades: petition, referral, hearing, defeat, repetition. It was the slow, steady insistence of a clock that refused to stop ticking. The patience required for this state-by-state campaign was the movement's greatest weapon against the entrenched resistance. We will now turn our attention to the legislative battles in the more populous, stubborn states of the Midwest and East, tracing the incremental movement that finally forced Congress to act on the federal amendment. When the Great War erupted in late July and early August 1914, the initial reaction in Washington was of profound, policy-driven caution. President Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, understood immediately that the sheer economic and ethnic complexity of the United States made involvement in the European conflict unthinkable. The immediate goal was not action, but definition, the precise legal and moral definition of American neutrality. On August 4, 1914, the President issued his first formal declaration of neutrality. The language was deliberately dry and legalistic, a necessary effort to remove emotion from the policy. But 3 weeks later, recognizing that declaring neutral was only half the task, Wilson issued a more profound statement, his appeal to the American people for impartiality. We focus on the careful drafting of this statement. It was a document born of quiet deliberation, a collaboration between the President and his close advisors. The core message was not just that America must be neutral in action, but that its citizens must be impartial in thought as well as in act. This was a profound and deliberate policy demand. The President was asking a nation of immigrants with deep ancestral ties to Britain, Germany, Ireland, and Italy to impose intellectual quietude upon their own strong personal sentiments. The enforcement of this neutrality began with the slow, meticulous work of the diplomatic corps. American ambassadors and ministers stationed in the capitals of the warring powers, London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, were suddenly recast as silent observers and cautious facilitators. Their primary duty was to transmit and receive diplomatic cables. Imagine the cable office in the basement of the State Department. The wire runs deep beneath the Atlantic, carrying encrypted messages at a speed that was revolutionary for the time. Yet the process of encoding, transmitting, and decoding these messages was still slow, repetitive, and required absolute accuracy. The cables were often formal, stilted, and concerned with minute details, the specific requirements for American ships sailing into certain zones, the precise status of American citizens stranded abroad, or the formal lodging of a protest against a minor violation of maritime law.
The goal of the State Department was to ensure that every single interaction with a belligerent nation was documented, justified, and measured against the precise legal standards of international neutrality. Every protest against a British seizure of cargo and every demand regarding German submarine activity was logged, indexed, and filed away. The sheer volume of documentation created by the policy of measured neutrality was staggering, a testament to the fact that maintaining non-intervention required more work than fighting a war. The diplomatic focus was entirely on precedent. When dealing with a seizure, an ambassador did not argue with emotion. They cited past treaties, previous international agreements, and the established rules of neutral rights. This adherence to legal formality transformed the chaos of war into a long, slow series of legalistic disputes, which, while frustrating, served to keep the United States out of the direct conflict. We will now turn our attention to the financial dimension of neutrality, the abstract, complex policy debates over whether American banks could lend money to the warring nations, and the quiet, persistent pressure applied by both the Allies and the Central Powers on American finance. The Committee on Public Information, CPI, led by George Creel, focuses on the slow, systemic, and repetitive dissemination of information and messaging, a process that is highly bureaucratic and intellectually measured. This is a story of organized repetition, perfect for a calm, non-dramatic narrative aimed at inducing sleep. The Committee on Public Information, CPI, was established by executive order in April 1917, immediately following America's declaration of war against Germany. Its formation was not accompanied by fanfare, but by the quiet, procedural agreement that the vast American public, diverse and often disengaged from European affairs, needed to be slowly and systematically educated on the reasons for intervention. George Creel, the journalist and former progressive reformer appointed by President Wilson to lead the CPI, understood that the effort could not rely on censorship or blatant propaganda. Instead, he based the entire structure on the doctrine of truth. Creel believed that the American people would support the war if they were given the facts, or at least the facts as the government wished them to be understood. The core mission was to turn a complex geopolitical conflict into a simple moral crusade, but to do so with the appearance of journalistic objectivity. The CPI quickly expanded into a complex, sprawling bureaucracy, organized into specialized divisions that targeted every available means of communication. We focus first on the division of news. This division's work was the most repetitive and least dramatic. Its staff did not write sensational stories. They prepared long, detailed press releases, often dry, fact-laden accounts of war aims, military preparations, and government policy. Every single day, hundreds of these standardized releases were dispatched via telegraph and mail to newspapers across the country. The language was meticulously controlled, ensuring that the same precise terms and official descriptions were used from New York to California. This repetitive,
continuous stream of controlled information had a subtle cumulative effect. It slowly began to standardize the public vocabulary of the war. Furthermore, the CPI established its own publication, the Official Bulletin. This was a dense, multi-paged document printed daily, containing only government announcements, executive orders, and departmental reports. Its format was designed to be boring, official, and utterly reliable. Imagine the quiet, repetitive work of the CPI's clerical staff, typing up the official bulletin, folding and stuffing envelopes, and meticulously checking the mailing lists. The goal was saturation, to ensure that no editor, no local official, and no influential community member could claim they had not received the official, documented perspective. This slow, steady diffusion of standardized information began the process of achieving quiet consensus. The CPI operated under the principle of filling the vacuum. By providing a constant, reliable, and uniform supply of information, they effectively marginalized competing or contradictory narratives. The voice of the government became the steady, repetitive background hum against which all other conversations took place. The mobilization of minds was therefore not a sudden conversion, but a slow, careful, systematic conditioning, achieved through the quiet rhythm of repetitive official communication. We will now turn our attention to the most unique and widespread arm of the CPI, the division of films and speakers. Tracing the slow, methodical dissemination of this unified message into the heart of every American community.
The implementation of the Selective Service Act of 1917 was a monumental administrative undertaking, achieved with astonishing speed and quiet efficiency. The goal was to replace the chaos of volunteers with the predictability of law. The first step in this process was Registration Day, June 5, 1917. On this single day, nearly 10 million men between the ages of 21 and 30 were required to register at local polling places, fire stations, or courthouses across the entire continental United States and its territories. The administrative key to this smooth process was the standardized registration card. We examined this card closely. It was a simple, rectangular piece of paper designed for maximum efficiency and minimum ambiguity. The card was divided into a precise sequence of numbered questions and blank spaces, each demanding a piece of verifiable data. Imagine the quiet, repetitive work of the registrars, local officials, teachers, and citizens who sat patiently at tables, helping each registrant fill out the form. The process was slow, deliberate, and identical in every precinct, from the largest city to the smallest, most remote town. The purpose was to ensure uniformity of data. Once the data was recorded, the registrar affixed a small pre-printed serial number to the card, a unique administrative identifier. This serial number immediately divorced the man from his name, transforming him into a fungible unit within a vast statistical whole. The name was personal, the number was procedural. Following the meticulous completion of the card,
The registrant details were transferred to the local board register book. This was a massive ledger bound in heavy cloth, the official document of the registration process. The handwriting was careful, the entries listed in sequential order according to the serial number. This book, stored quietly in a safe or vault, became the primary legal record, a testament to the fact that the entire process was defined by documentation and orderly compliance. The quiet turning of the pages of these ledger books across the nation was the true sound of mobilization. The purpose of this massive administrative effort was not immediate conscription, but the creation of a definitive list, a national inventory of eligible manpower, ordered and ready for the next procedural step, the national lottery. The calm, systematic nature of this initial accounting was intended to instill trust that the process would be fair, predictable, and entirely free of political favoritism. We will now turn to the mathematical procedure that followed registration, the randomized selection of the order of service, tracing the quiet, abstract power of the numbered capsule. The election of Warren Harding in 1920 was not a mandate for revolution, it was a plea for relief. The American people, having endured the emotional strain of World War, the intense administrative pressure of the draft, and the moral rigor of Wilsonian foreign policy, desired only a simple, non-dramatic restoration of familiar routines. Harding's famous call for normalcy was the soothing prescription they craved. The initial work of the Harding administration, therefore, was to manage a vast intentional de-escalation. The first step was the slow, methodical process of dismantling the immense temporary federal bureaucracy that had been constructed to run the war machine. Thousands of temporary agencies, boards, and commissions, which had dictated everything from food prices to railroad schedules, began the patient process of self-liquidation. Imagine the large, often makeshift offices in Washington, D.C., now characterized by a palpable sense of winding down. Clerks quietly sorted through stacks of war bonds, cataloged tons of surplus equipment, and filed away the exhaustive reports of the Committee on Public Information, CPI. The process was one of administrative subtraction, of carefully removing the regulatory hand of government from the everyday lives of citizens. The sound of this work was defined by silence, the slow, repetitive shush of files being archived, the thump of empty desks being cleared, and the eventual quiet locking of doors on agencies that no longer needed to exist. This policy of minimal intervention extended to the political rhetoric itself. Harding consciously adopted a style that was understated and agreeable. Where Wilson's speeches had been complex, intellectual, and morally demanding, Harding's were often simple, genial, and intentionally vague. The goal was to remove the sense of urgency from the political atmosphere. The national conversation was lowered from a feverish pitch to a steady, predictable murmur. The lack of demanding political debates allowed the public's attention to drift away from Washington and back toward local, domestic interests.
The most profound expression of this slowing down was in foreign policy. the nation formally withdrew into a stance of isolationism. The most pressing issue upon Harding's inauguration was the resolution of the war itself, which technically still persisted because the U.S. Senate had rejected the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Harding's solution was the Knox-Porter Resolution, 1921, a purely legalistic act that simply declared the war over, independently of the European powers. This was a classic act of normalcy, dealing with a grand global problem through a simple domestic legal procedure. The resolution was short, its language was dry, and its effect was to quietly and decisively sever the legal threads that bound the U.S. to the complex continuing affairs of Europe. The silence that followed this declaration was the sound of a nation turning its back on the world and settling into the familiar, undemanding confines of its own borders. We will now turn our attention to the financial side of this restoration, tracing the quiet work of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon to reduce the national debt and implement a stable, predictable fiscal policy based on tax reduction and budget trimming. The foundation of the assembly line is not the automobile itself, but the concept of conveyance, the idea that the object being built must move, and the worker must remain still. Before this innovation, workers moved around the stationary car chassis, searching for parts and tools, a chaotic and inefficient process. The Ford system reversed this entirely, imposing stillness upon labor and motion upon the product. We focus first on the main assembly line. Imagine a heavy steel track running hundreds of feet across the factory floor, moving at a slow, deliberate, and entirely unchanging speed. The speed is key. It is precisely calibrated, not too fast to induce frenzy, but fast enough to ensure that every minute of the workday yields a pre-calculated fraction of a completed vehicle. The pace is measured, relentless, and designed to minimize wasted motion. The work is organized through the principle of extreme subdivision of labor. The complex task of building an automobile is broken down into hundreds of minuscule, repeatable steps. No single worker builds an entire chassis. Instead, each worker performs only one, simple, highly specialized action. We observe the first stage, the slow arrival of the frame. The heavy steel skeleton is lowered onto the conveyor belt. The motion begins. The workers along this section are performing only the most foundational tasks. Station 1, bolt placement. The worker reaches into a standardized bin, retrieves a specific size of bolt, and places it into the pre-drilled hole in the frame. Repetition. Repetition. Station 2, the nut application. The next worker applies the corresponding nut to the exposed thread. Repetition. Repetition. Station 3, the slow tightening. The third worker uses a pneumatic tool preset to a specific torque to slowly, steadily tighten the nut. The zzz of the tool is brief, measured, and instantly repeated on the next moving frame. Each worker's action is timed to the movement of the line. They have a predetermined number of seconds, perhaps 40, perhaps 60,
to complete their single solitary task before the frame moves beyond their reach and presents the next identical frame for them to begin their task again. This creates a powerful hypnotic rhythm of the repetitive task. The worker does not hurry the work hurries the worker, but at a controlled, predictable pace. The key to the efficiency is the standardized part. Every bolt, every bracket, every piece of sheet metal arriving at the line is identical to the one before it and the one that will follow. This standardization of components is the silent, unsung prerequisite for the rhythm of the line.
We will now follow the moving chassis through the middle stages, observing the slow, systematic accretion of larger components, from the wheels to the engine, all synchronized to the steady, unvarying pace of the endless loop. The enforcement of the 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, did not begin with dramatic arrests, but with the dry, tedious work of defining the law itself. The amendment was simple. It prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. The complexity lay in the accompanying legislation, the National Prohibition Act, commonly known as the Volstead Act, passed later that year. The Volstead Act was a document of profound legal complexity and contradiction. Its primary task was to define intoxicating liquor, which it did by setting a maximum alcoholic content of 0.5% by volume. This technical, seemingly minor percentage was the fundamental metric of enforcement, separating the legal beverage from the illegal substance. However, the act immediately created vast gray areas requiring constant bureaucratic attention. It allowed the manufacture and sale of alcohol for medicinal, sacramental, and industrial purposes. This carved out immense, necessary exceptions that required the creation of an entirely new administrative system for issuing permits and monitoring legal production. We focus first on the Bureau of Prohibition, initially housed within the Treasury Department. This agency's immediate task was one of administration and accounting, not policing. Thousands of new forms had to be designed, printed, and distributed. Every doctor who wished to prescribe medicinal whiskey, every priest who needed sacramental wine, and every industrial chemist who required denatured alcohol had to file an application and secure a federal permit. Imagine the atmosphere in the permit division. Stacks of applications, each requiring slow, meticulous review. Clerks, working under the soft, focused light of desk lamps, checked the applicant's credentials, verified their need, and recorded the exact quantity of alcohol requested. The sound was the steady, rhythmic scribble of a pen, the squeak of a rubber stamp, and the perpetual hush of bureaucracy. The most challenging task was the control of industrial alcohol. The act allowed industrial producers to use vast quantities of alcohol for products like perfumes, lacquers, and fuels, provided the alcohol was denatured, chemically treated to make it undrinkable. The Bureau of Prohibition's chemists had to develop precise, standardized formulas for denaturing alcohol, ensuring that the additive was effective but did not destroy the industrial utility. This work was slow, scientific,
and highly technical, a continuous, quiet struggle between laboratory precision and market demand. The quiet, relentless challenge of the enforcement agencies was the sheer paperwork. Every gallon legally produced, legally transported, and legally sold under the vast exceptions of the Volstead Act had to be tracked, documented, and accounted for. The law created a paper trail intended to be so precise and so comprehensive that any deviation, any missing gallon, would instantly signal an illicit diversion to the bootlegging trade. The enforcement of prohibition in its essence was a monumental accounting problem. We will now turn our attention to the agents themselves, the prohibition agents, tracing their slow, methodical work of evidence collection and legal preparation that was required to successfully prosecute cases in the federal courts. The speculative bubble of the late 1920s was not inflated by cash. It was inflated by credit. The key mechanism that allowed millions of new investors to enter the market and to push prices far beyond their logical value was the practice of buying on margin. To understand the quiet, insidious nature of this practice, we must first examine the procedure itself. When an investor bought stock on margin, they were not paying the full price. Instead, they were required to pay only a small percentage of the stock's value, often as little as 10 to 20%, with their own cash. The remainder was borrowed from their broker. This borrowed debt was the unseen debt.
Imagine an investor deciding to purchase $10,000 worth of stock. Under a 10% margin requirement, the investor would pay only $1,000. The remaining $9,000 was immediately borrowed, recorded as a liability on the brokerage firm's books. The stock itself was held by the broker as collateral. This procedure was entirely legal, common, and most importantly, easy. The ease of the transaction masked the inherent mathematical risk. This borrowing process introduced an immense yet abstract multiplier effect into the financial system. Every dollar of real money placed into the market generated 9 additional dollars of borrowed money, all chasing the same finite number of stocks. This created an artificial, gentle inflation of demand. Prices rose not because the underlying value of the companies changed overnight, but because the purchasing power being deployed was largely fabricated from credit. The ease of obtaining this credit was due to the call loan. Brokers, in turn, did not finance this vast debt themselves. They borrowed the necessary funds from banks and large corporations on what were called call loans or brokers' loans. These loans were characterized by their simplicity and their instability. They had no fixed repayment date and could be called, demanded for repayment, by the lender at any time, often with only 24 hours' notice. We focus on the daily routine in the financial district. Each morning, banks and corporations with surplus cash would quietly communicate their willingness to lend money to the brokers. The interest rate on these call loans, known as the call rate, would be set. This process was a quiet, continuous negotiation, recorded in terse, efficient notes. When the market was booming, the demand for margin funds was high, and the call rate would rise, but the money always flowed. This constant daily infusion of borrowed funds was the steady drip that inflated the bubble. The danger of this system was its delicate balance. As long as stock prices continued their slow, steady ascent, the borrowed funds were safe, as the value of the collateral, the stock, always exceeded the amount of the loan. The unseen debt was quietly supported by the market's predictable trajectory. However, the system was entirely reliant on the premise of unending growth. We will now examine the simple procedural danger of the margin call, the mathematical mechanism designed to protect the lender, but which, when triggered simultaneously across the market, became the engine of disaster. The events of Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, were characterized by the sheer, overwhelming volume of transactions. The New York Stock Exchange recorded the sale of over 16.4 million shares that day. This volume was so unprecedented that the entire administrative machinery of Wall Street, the communication systems, the clerical staff, and the mechanical recording devices simply broke down. Our focus is not on the trading floor, but on the back offices of the brokerage houses. While the market roared, thousands of clerks were attempting the impossible task of processing the transactions. The process of buying or selling a share of stock required a sequence of steps: confirmation of the trade, preparation of the ticket, transmission of the details, and the eventual entry into the customer's ledger. On Black Tuesday and the days immediately following, the backlog was immense. Clerks worked around the clock, sleeping on cots in their offices. They were performing the same simple, repetitive tasks hour after hour, sorting trade tickets, verifying prices, and attempting to reconcile the vast discrepancies between the records of the buyer and the seller. The primary sound was the rhythmic clicking of the key punches and the incessant rattling of the mechanical adding machines as they totaled up columns of impossible figures. This administrative delay was the first layer of slow realization. For days, not even the most senior broker knew the exact final tally of the loss. The official closing prices were known, but the millions of transactions were not yet settled. The accounts were not yet balanced. The scale of the financial damage was initially hidden beneath a pile of paper. This quiet, desperate clerical work exposed the vulnerability of the entire system, its reliance on manual processing. The mechanical ticker tapes were hours behind, unable to keep up with the volume, meaning that even the traders on the floor did not know the current price of a stock until minutes after it had traded. This delay created a pervasive, slow-moving sense of uncertainty, a mathematical fog that obscured the true nature of the disaster. The most profound expression of this slowing down was in foreign policy. The nation formally withdrew into a stance of isolationism. The most pressing issue upon Harding's inauguration was the resolution of the war itself, which technically still persisted because the U.S. Senate had rejected the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Harding's solution was the Knox-Porter Resolution, 1921, a purely legalistic act that simply declared the war over, independently of the European powers. This was a classic act of normalcy, dealing with a grand global problem through a simple domestic legal procedure. The resolution was short, its language was dry, and its effect was to quietly and decisively sever the legal threads that bound the U.S. to the complex, continuing affairs of Europe. The silence that followed this declaration was the sound of a nation turning its back on the world and settling into the familiar, undemanding confines of its own borders. We will now turn our attention to the financial side of this restoration, tracing the quiet work of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon to reduce the national debt and implement a stable, predictable fiscal policy based on tax reduction and budget trimming. The foundation of the assembly line is not the automobile itself, but the concept of conveyance, the idea that the object being built must move and the worker must remain still. Before this innovation, workers moved around the stationary car chassis, searching for parts and tools, a chaotic and inefficient process. The Ford system reversed this entirely, imposing stillness upon labor and motion upon the product. We focus first on the main assembly line. Imagine a heavy steel track running hundreds of feet across the factory floor, moving at a slow, deliberate, and entirely unchanging speed. The speed is key. It is precisely calibrated, not too fast to induce frenzy, but fast enough to ensure that every minute of the workday yields a pre-calculated fraction of a completed vehicle. The pace is measured, relentless, and designed to minimize wasted motion. The work is organized through the principle of extreme subdivision of labor. The complex task of building an automobile is broken down into hundreds of minuscule, repeatable steps. No single worker builds an entire chassis. Instead, each worker performs only one simple, highly specialized action. We observe the first stage, the slow arrival of the frame. The heavy steel skeleton is lowered onto the conveyor belt. The motion begins. The workers along this section are performing only the most foundational tasks. Station 1, bolt placement. The worker reaches into a standardized bin, retrieves a specific size of bolt, and places it into the pre-drilled hole in the frame. Repetition, repetition. Station 2, nut application. The next worker applies the corresponding nut to the exposed thread. Repetition, repetition. Station 3, the slow tightening. The third worker uses a pneumatic tool preset to a specific torque to slowly, steadily tighten the nut. The zzz of the tool is brief, measured, and instantly repeated on the next moving frame. Each worker's action is timed to the movement of the line. They have a predetermined number of seconds, perhaps 40, perhaps 60, to complete their single, solitary task before the frame moves beyond their reach and presents the next identical frame for them to begin their task again. This creates a powerful, hypnotic rhythm of the repetitive task. The worker does not hurry the work. The work hurries the worker, but at a controlled, predictable pace. The key to the efficiency is the standardized part. Every bolt, every bracket, every piece of sheet metal arriving at the line is identical to the one before it and the one that will follow. This eliminates the need for filing, fitting, or adjusting. The parts simply fit, smoothly and instantly. This standardization of components is the silent, unsung prerequisite for the rhythm of the line. We will now follow the moving chassis through the middle stages, observing the slow, systematic accretion of larger components,
from the wheels to the engine, all synchronized to the steady, unvarying pace of the endless loop. The enforcement of the 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, did not begin with dramatic arrests, but with the dry, tedious work of defining the law itself. The amendment was simple. It prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. The complexity lay in the accompanying legislation, the National Prohibition Act, commonly known as the Volstead Act, passed later that year. The Volstead Act was a document of profound legal complexity and contradiction. Its primary task was to define intoxicating liquor, which it did by setting a maximum alcoholic content of 0.5% by volume. This technical, seemingly minor percentage was the fundamental metric of enforcement, separating the legal beverage from the illegal substance. However, the act immediately created vast gray areas requiring constant bureaucratic attention. It allowed the manufacture and sale of alcohol for medicinal, sacramental, and industrial purposes. This carved out immense necessary exceptions that required the creation of an entirely new administrative system for issuing permits and monitoring legal production. We focus first on the Bureau of Prohibition, initially housed within the Treasury Department. This agency's immediate task was of administration and accounting, not policing. Thousands of new forms had to be designed, printed, and distributed. Every doctor who wished to prescribe medicinal whiskey, every priest who needed sacramental wine, and every industrial chemist who required denatured alcohol had to file an application and secure a federal permit.
The atmosphere in the permit division was one of slow, meticulous review. Stacks of applications, each requiring a slow, meticulous review. Clerks, working under the soft, focused light of desk lamps, checked the applicant's credentials, verified their need, and recorded the exact quantity of alcohol requested. The sound was the steady, rhythmic scribble of a pen, the squeak of a rubber stamp, and the perpetual hush of bureaucracy. The most challenging task was the control of industrial alcohol. The act allowed industrial producers to use vast quantities of alcohol for products like perfumes, lacquers, and fuels, provided the alcohol was denatured, chemically treated to make it undrinkable. The Bureau of Prohibition's chemists had to develop precise, standardized formulas for denaturing alcohol, ensuring that the additive was effective but did not destroy the industrial utility. This work was slow, scientific, and highly technical, a continuous, quiet struggle between laboratory precision and market demand. The quiet, relentless challenge of the enforcement agencies was the sheer paperwork. Every gallon legally produced, legally transported, and legally sold under the vast exceptions of the Volstead Act had to be tracked, documented, and accounted for. The law created a paper trail intended to be so precise and so comprehensive that any deviation, any missing gallon, would instantly signal an illicit diversion to the bootlegging trade. The enforcement of prohibition was, in its essence, a monumental accounting problem. We will now turn our attention to the agents themselves, the prohibition agents, tracing their slow, methodical work of evidence collection and legal preparation that was required to successfully prosecute cases in the federal courts.
The speculative bubble of the late 1920s was not inflated by cash, it was inflated by credit. The key mechanism that allowed millions of new investors to enter the market and to push prices far beyond their logical value was the practice of buying on margin. To understand the quiet, insidious nature of this practice, we must first examine the procedure itself. When an investor bought stock on margin, they were not paying the full price. Instead, they were required to pay only a small percentage of the stock's value, often as little as 10 to 20%, with their own cash. The remainder was borrowed from their broker. This borrowed portion was the unseen debt. Imagine an investor deciding to purchase $10,000 worth of stock. Under a 10% margin requirement, the investor would pay only $1,000. The remaining $9,000 was immediately borrowed, recorded as a liability on the brokerage's firm's books. The stock itself was held by the broker as collateral. This procedure was entirely legal, common, and most importantly, easy. The ease of the transaction masked the inherent mathematical risk. This borrowing process introduced an immense yet abstract multiplier effect into the financial system. Every dollar of real money placed into the market generated 9 additional dollars of borrowed money, all chasing the same finite number of stocks. This created an artificial, gentle inflation of demand. Prices rose not because the underlying value of the companies changed overnight, but because the purchasing power being deployed was largely fabricated from credit. The ease of obtaining this credit was due to the call loan. Brokers, in turn, did not finance this vast debt themselves. They borrowed the necessary funds from banks and large corporations on what were called call loans or brokers' loans. These loans were characterized by their simplicity and their instability. They had no fixed repayment date and could be called, demanded for repayment, by the lender at any time, often with only 24 hours notice. We focus on the daily routine in the financial district. Each morning, banks and corporations with surplus cash would quietly communicate their willingness to lend money to the brokers. The interest rate on these call loans, known as the call rate, would be set. This process was a quiet, continuous negotiation recorded in terse, efficient notes. When the market was booming, the demand for margin funds was high, and the call rate would rise, but the money always flowed. This constant, daily infusion of borrowed funds was the steady drip that inflated the bubble. The danger of this system was its delicate balance. As long as stock prices continued their slow, steady ascent, the borrowed funds were safe, as the value of the collateral, the stock, always exceeded the amount of the loan. The unseen debt was quietly supported by the market's predictable trajectory. However, the system was entirely reliant on the premise of endless growth. We will now examine the simple, procedural danger of the margin call, the mathematical mechanism designed to protect the lender, but which, when triggered simultaneously across the market, became the engine of disaster. The events of Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, were characterized by the sheer, overwhelming volume of transactions. The New York Stock Exchange recorded the sale of over 16.4 million shares that day. This volume was so unprecedented that the entire administrative machinery of Wall Street, the communication systems, the clerical staff, and the mechanical recording devices simply broke down. Our focus is not on the trading floor, but in the back offices of the brokerage houses. While the market roared, thousands of clerks were attempting the impossible task of processing the transactions. The process of buying or selling a share of stock required a sequence of steps: confirmation of the trade, preparation of the ticket, transmission of the details, and the eventual entry into the customer's ledger.
The true final measure of the loss, the ultimate numerical decline of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, was not definitively calculated until days later, when the records were finally caught up and reconciled. The average, which had stood at 381.17 on September 3rd, had dropped to 230.07 by the close of Black Tuesday. This was the first cold figure of the collapse, meticulously recorded in the financial register. We will now turn our attention to the immediate aftermath, focusing on the weeks that followed, tracing the slow, methodical process by which the hidden death of margin buying was exposed, and the banking system began its own calculated descent. The day of the Dust Bowl migrant began not with anticipation, but with the immediate dull requirement of preparation. The sun rose, harsh and clear, and the first task was the methodical, slow process of packing the vehicle. We focus on the car itself, usually an old sedan, a dilapidated truck, or a cobbled-together machine that was already strained far beyond its intended capacity. Every item brought from the dried-out farm had to be secured with ropes, chains, and careful geometry. The spare tire, the bedding, the cooking pot, the tools, all were tied down in a slow, precise pattern on the roof, the running boards, and the rear deck. The movement was repetitive, the knots were standardized, and the sound was the dull thump of canvas against metal. The silence of the morning was broken only by the necessary movements of the labor. Once packed, the engine required its own ritual. The cars were old, and the heat and the dust were unforgiving. The driver would slowly check the oil level, pour water into the radiator, and meticulously inspect the worn treads of the tires. This was a quiet, necessary act of mechanical maintenance, performed every morning, reinforcing the fact that the journey's success was entirely dependent on the steady, reliable function of the simple machine. Finally, the family settled into the crowded cab, children nestled among blankets and boxes, the air already thick with the scent of old canvas and gasoline. The engine would catch, often with a groan, and the slow process of pulling the overloaded vehicle onto the highway began. The speed was uniformly low, often no more than 30 or 35 miles per hour, the velocity dictated by the strained transmission, the worn tires, and the simple physical risk of traveling faster. The highway itself was a ribbon of concrete and asphalt, laid down block by block in the previous decades. The texture of the road created the primary sensory rhythm. The repetitive thump-thump as the tires passed over the expansion joints in the concrete provided a constant, audible metronome for the day's journey. This sound was the steady, unwavering counterpoint to the endless visual procession of telephone poles, fences, and the vast, receding horizon. For the driver, the day was a study in monotony and attention. The eyes scanned the road for irregularities. The ears listened for the slightest change in the engine's drone, and the hands maintained a constant, slow pressure on the steering wheel, correcting for the vehicle's natural tendency to drift.
There was no scenery to distract, only the subtle, incremental changes in the terrain. Every mile passed was a physical victory, recorded quietly in the driver's mind and documented only by the slow turning numbers on the odometer. We will now follow the migrant's routine to the midday stop, the methodical process of rest, simple repair, and the necessary rationing of the precious, dwindling resources carried across the continent. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, created in 1933, was one of the quickest and most ambitious New Deal agencies. Its purpose was simple: to take young, unemployed men from cities and move them into organized, disciplined camps to work on natural resource conservation projects. The speed and scale of this mobilization were achieved entirely through the immediate implementation of a standardized camp management manual. We examine the manual itself, a heavy, dense document divided into clearly labeled, numbered sections. The central principle of the CCC was uniformity. Every one of the thousands of CCC camps, from the forests of Oregon to the streams of Maine, was required to operate under the same set of strict, standardized rules. The first procedural step was enrollment. The manual laid out a slow, multi-stage process for selecting recruits. The emphasis was on the methodical execution of these small, repetitive actions. Every morning, the same bugle call, the same movements, the same list of equipment being checked out and checked back in. This rhythm imposed a necessary stability on young men who had previously experienced the chaos of poverty. The tools themselves were issued and tracked using standardized inventory forms, ensuring that the government could account for its assets at every moment. This meticulous record-keeping was the quiet bedrock of the entire conservation effort, proving that the CCC was a mechanism of order and administration first, and labor second. We will now turn to the most challenging aspect of the CCC's rules, the detailed project manuals, which dictated the precise engineering specifications for every terracing, tree planting, and dam building task across the national parks and forests. The fireside chats were revolutionary because they broke with the tradition of formal public oratory. They were consciously designed to sound spontaneous, yet they were executed with meticulous, calculated control. The very setting, the White House library or study, with its quiet acoustics and implied warmth, was chosen to reinforce the illusion of intimacy. We focus first on the technical setup. A single high-quality microphone was placed before the president. The studio engineer's goal was not volume, but clarity and closeness. The microphone was positioned to capture the texture of Roosevelt's voice, allowing listeners to feel as if he were sitting just a few feet away, addressing them alone. The sound level was carefully calibrated to avoid any harshness or sudden shifts in volume. This technical preparation ensured that the voice entering the home was consistently soft, stable, and non-threatening. The primary element of the chat's power was the pacing. The average speed of Roosevelt's delivery in these addresses was noticeably slower than typical political speech. Every sentence was given its full weight. Pauses were deliberate and often extended, allowing the listener time for full comprehension and absorption of the message. This slow pace was a conscious rhetorical device, a technique of tonal calm designed to counter the psychological haste and anxiety of the Great Depression.
The language of the chats was another key to their soothing effect. Roosevelt, with the help of his advisors, stripped the policy explanations of unnecessary political jargon and complex economic terminology. He relied instead on simple, familiar analogies and repeated phrases. Consider the first fireside chat, delivered during the 1933 banking crisis. The message was complex, explaining the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking, but the language was simple. The president referred to the banks as places where people kept their money for safekeeping, like a strongbox. He used the repetitive, calm phrase, "Your money is safer in a reopened bank than it was before." This repetition of simple, reassuring concepts created an auditory rhythm that instilled confidence, not through argument, but through tonal certainty. The structure of each chat was designed for predictability. They often followed a slow, three-part rhetorical pattern. Acknowledge the problem in a calm, unalarming tone. Explain the solution using simple, non-technical language. Assign a role to the citizen, a call to quiet, individual action. The entire broadcast lasted a precise, predetermined length, usually between 15 and 30 minutes. The knowledge that the message would be clear, comprehensible, and of a set duration contributed to the listener's sense of control and stability. The whole experience was a carefully controlled sequence of sounds and ideas, designed to replace fear with patient, informed waiting. We will now examine the subtle rhetoric of the chats, tracing the repetitive use of reassuring metaphors and the measured explanation of complex legislation, like the New Deal's recovery programs. The Social Security Act was born out of the necessity to provide economic stability during old age and unemployment. The primary challenge was creating a system that was legally sustainable and politically acceptable. The architects of the act, working under President Roosevelt's Committee on Economic Security, CES, chose the principle of contributory social insurance. We focus on the CES itself, a small group of quiet academics, economists, and legal experts who spent over a year compiling reports. Their work was one of constant, measured deliberation, rejecting dozens of proposals until they settled on a fiscally conservative model. Benefits would be paid not from general tax revenues, but from a dedicated fund generated by contributions, taxes, from both the employee and the employer. This established the quiet, crucial link between work and benefit. The resulting legislation, the Social Security Act, was a massive, complex document that addressed multiple, separate forms of economic risk. It was divided into a sequence of 11 distinct titles, each governing a separate aspect of the social safety net. To understand the Act, we must deconstruct its most fundamental procedural sections. We begin with the most enduring element, laid out in Title II, Federal Old Age Benefits. This section established the federal government's responsibility to provide benefits to retired workers. It was here that the law demanded the creation of the most massive administrative system in U.S. history, the lifetime earning record. This record required the methodical tracking of every eligible worker's wages, quarter by quarter, from the start of the system until retirement. The entire concept was based on the numerical predictability. To fund these benefits, Title VIII of the Act imposed the Federal Insurance Contributions Act,
FICA tax, a small, precisely defined percentage of wages automatically deducted by the employer. Imagine the atmosphere in the new Social Security offices in the mid-1930s. The first task was organizational, assigning Social Security numbers, SSNs. This was a purely administrative identifier, a sequential, unique 9-digit number designed to ensure that the earnings of John Smith in New York were not confused with John Smith in California. The process involved the slow, methodical printing, distribution, and assignment of millions of these numbers, a quiet, bureaucratic foundation laid across the entire country. This massive organizational effort, driven by the clear, complex mandates of the law, was designed to operate on a continuous, mechanical basis. It was a system built to function slowly, predictably, and patiently for generations, providing an inherent stability that the volatile market could not. We will now examine the subtle technical feature of the Act, tracing the precise formulas used to ensure that the inflow of taxes would perpetually match the future outflow of benefits. The initial measured steps toward material aid were governed by the stringent framework of the Neutrality Acts. Following the outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939, President Roosevelt needed a way to supply Britain and France without formally compromising neutrality. The immediate solution was the Cash and Carry Amendment. This policy was the first expression of the slow, methodical pace of American aid. The orders were dry, legalistic, and non-negotiable. Cash. Belligerent nations had to pay immediately in full for any supplies purchased in the United States. No loans, no credit, no debt. Carry. The purchasing nation was entirely responsible for transporting the goods away from American ports using their own ships. American vessels were legally prohibited from entering the war zones. This policy created an immense, quiet logistical challenge for the Allies. It meant that every transaction required the slow, bureaucratic process of converting foreign currency reserves into American dollars, securing payment, and then organizing a fleet of cargo ships to cross the dangerous Atlantic, all while the ships were vulnerable to German U-boats. The American role was passive. The goods were sold, and then, legally, the transaction was complete.
However, as the war progressed and Britain's financial reserves dwindled, this system reached its limit. The British were simply running out of cash to purchase the necessary material. The impending crisis required a new, more profound bureaucratic and legislative solution, leading to the drafting of the Lend-Lease Act. The drafting of this act was a long, complex undertaking involving lawyers and advisors who meticulously constructed the law to bypass the legal restrictions of neutrality. Introduced in December 1940 as H.R. 1776, the law was framed as an essential act of national defense, allowing the President to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of any defense article to any country whose defense was deemed vital to the defense of the United States. The passage of the Act in March 1941 marked the true administrative beginning of the arsenal of democracy. It required the immediate creation of the Office of Lend-Lease Administration, a vast new agency tasked solely with the complex work of inventory, allocation, and shipment.
The sound of this new organization was the repetitive, rhythmic clack of typewriters producing standardized request forms and allocation manifests. The initial work was purely procedural, establishing the categories of aid, N, food, industrial raw materials, and creating a uniform request system that British and other Allied officials were required to follow. This bureaucratic structure was the quiet engine of American entry into global affairs. We will now turn to the physical reality of this aid, the slow, methodical conversion of American industry from producing peacetime goods to producing war materials, and the tracking of material aid through the vast, complex supply chain.